from North Shropshire. Welcome, Helen. Nukey, over to you.
Thanks so much, Richard, and thank you for the little mention. So, as Richard has said, I'm absolutely elated to sit with you all this morning and introduce the newest Liberal Democrat member for Parliament, Helen Morgan. Before we get started, just a couple of quick notes on housekeeping. Please do stay on mute so we can limit any background noise and make sure everybody can hear both of us very clearly. I do have a set of questions that I'd like to ask Helen, but we would love to go to the audience and pick up some questions from there as well. We have an incredibly tight schedule, as I'm sure you can imagine. Helen's diary is particularly busy, and so we're going to have a 45-minute chat with her. On that basis, I'll field any questions that we get into the chat via myself, just so we can try and get through as many as possible. And if we don't get through all of them, then we'll make sure that we pass any questions that were not asked over to Helen's team after the session. So, without further ado, not that she needs any introduction, just a brief bio on Helen. So prior to her breathtaking by-election result in November, Helen was a councillor for her local parish council, and Helen went into the North Shropshire by-election with a proven track record in local campaigning, including on issues such as improving the safety on rural roads. During the pandemic, Helen set up the COVID response group in her village, building on a public service history of running marathons for charities and being a trustee for her son's nursery. And then on the 16th of December 2021, Helen was elected to the Houses of Parliament with the 7th largest swing in UK by-election history. And she joins us today to give us a bit of insight into her experience. So Helen, my first question to you is, how are you doing and how are you?
Yeah, I'm okay, thank you. It's been just an enormous whirlwind, I think, since the beginning of November when the by-election started. There hasn't really been a chance to stop, but it is really enjoyable, but it's really, really full on. So the election was on the 17th of December. I think we got 3 team members recruited and in work by the 7th of February, which
wow.
was a good start. The casework is coming in at a phenomenal rate, so there's a lot to do, but it is really enjoyable. But I haven't got used to it at all yet. So as you can imagine, it's to go from being a parish councillor in a seat which wasn't really expected to win or be a target seat to the sort of full-on by-election machine, and then to win, it's just totally unexpected and quite hard to get used to.
I can imagine. And one of the first questions I wanted to ask you is, obviously, like, you know, all of the work that you and the local party have put in, it didn't start in November of 2021. So what would you say were pivotal kind of actions or decisions or kind of tasks that you and the local party took on that resulted in the outcome that we had at the end of last year?
Well, I think it's been a process that's been ongoing for a few years. So we were quite a small local party that was quite unambitious, I think it would be fair to say, sort of prior to 2019, really. And we've just been not growing our membership so much as developing our membership since then. So we've had increasingly engaged and active members. And I think the turning point for us was probably the May elections in 2021. We were able to get out a good slate of candidates, not quite a full one, but a really, really good slate of candidates who were all really motivated. And we worked as a team to deliver and canvass in a good chunk of wards across North Shropshire. So by the time the by-election happened, I think a lot of people were quite used to seeing us out and about and knew what we stood for. And we've been able to deliver this sort of important local community message across quite a large chunk of the constituency, and that made us credible when the by-election happened, because it wasn't the first time people had heard from us. Mm-hmm. So I think that was the critical thing. Those May elections were the turning point for us, really. And at the time we were quite disappointed, because if you can remember back to this time last year, we were in a lockdown, so we weren't able to campaign. If you remember, we weren't even able to hand deliver leaflets. So we felt that we'd been a bit sort of scuppered by that lockdown process. And as it turned out, we didn't win the council seats that we wanted to, but we had got enough of our message out there, I think, to make us credible when the by-election came along.
Fantastic. And I think that resonates with some of the comments that Joe and Laura are making in the session earlier, and also with some of the comments that we've seen in the chat around the fact that building up to this kind of outcome is something that takes time and takes energy, and local elections play a fundamental part of. Okay, so a different tone of question for you. What did you enjoy the most about the campaign?
It was quite a bruising campaign, one way or another. I think what I enjoyed most actually was being around the volunteers and the team. The head office team are absolutely superb, and it was just brilliant. You know, all these people came from the West Midlands and beyond, and it was just lovely to meet so many people who were just having a great time, and it had a really good vibe about it, the by-election, but just so kind of focused on what they were going to do and enjoy getting that job done. And that was really by far the best bit of it. I just met hundreds and hundreds of people every weekend, and it was really, really nice.
Did you meet any particularly interesting kind of voters or residents or anything that kind of sticks in your mind in terms of contact with them kind of outside of the volunteer team?
Do you know, the canvassing conversation that sticks in my mind most was with a man in Trefonnan who told me that he voted Conservative because he thought Boris Johnson was honest and straight talking and a man of the people, unlike the others who are all lawyers. And I just remember thinking, wow, you know, you've been completely hoodwinked and not really know how to respond to that. You know, normally when you have a conversation on the doorstep, you can work out very quickly whether it's worth your while sort of having a debate, and you know what you want to say if you've decided that it is worth your while getting stuck in. But he was such a nice man and so friendly. I just didn't know what to say. That's the conversation that sticks out most. But the other thing that stuck out really was that, particularly with older women, they were really up for a change. Actually, they really. I'm generalising hugely, and you shouldn't do that. But I noticed that the doorsteps that I got stuck on for hours and hours tended to be older women, and they were really turned off by Boris Johnson and keen to vote for something different and somebody that they thought would stand up for their interests. So that was another interesting sort of element of it all.
Okay, well, that actually brings me nicely onto another question, which kind of, again, leads into kind of demographics and thinking about the profile of the residents and voters that you were coming into contact with. And I think one of the things that came through really strongly in your campaign, at least at the times that I went down, was the criticality about recognising the rural elements of the constituency and making sure that those concerns and those voices were heard. So what lessons can you share from your campaign in terms of connecting with rural voters?
Well, obviously it's really challenging because you have to, a lot of the time it's not very time efficient to go and see rural voters because you've got to drive a long way to get there. The way that the houses are spaced out means that you can spend 2 hours and only speak to 5 people. So it is an extra challenge, there's no question about it, but it is really worthwhile doing. And you can kind of grade villages into the bigger ones that it is worth visiting. You can do 2 or 3 of those in a day, and then you have reached a reasonable number of people. And you don't need to go to them as often as you do the urban areas because no one ever goes there. That one visit will have a really big impact. Mm-hmm. So when we went to places, I went to a place called Tilstock, which I don't think anyone's ever been to before. And when we knocked on doors there, they were just stunned actually that we'd bothered to go, that they'd had leaflets delivered. And a man there told me that they'd all been discussing it in the pub and deciding who they were going to kind of vote for as a community, which I thought was fascinating. And I think if you can get to those places, it really does have an impact. And because it's unusual for them to be targeted, you don't need to be going every week. You can go less regularly, and it will still have the same impact. In a more urban area where there's stuff going through the door all the time, whether it's from farm foods or a political message, those leaflets just kind of get lost a bit more in the mire, and so you have to do more and more and more to have an impact with those people.
Okay, that is fascinating, and I think the fact that you were bearing that kind of thing in mind, and the team was bearing that kind of thing in mind as they progressed through the campaign, really, really speaks to why this was such a historic outcome. But on a personal level, how does it feel to have cemented yourself in the history books in this kind of way?
Well, it's very odd, and I still haven't really, it hasn't really sunk in, if I'm honest. The whole thing about sort of turning up in London every week and walking into the Palace of Westminster, it just feels very odd. And the historic sort of element of it is also hard to to get your head around, really. I mean, my family are just like, oh God, you're on the telly all the time. That obviously that's waned obviously since then, and I think everybody's very relieved about that. But it is difficult to get used to. And the other thing I've noticed is that when I've been to briefings for MPs on various things, you know, we've had them on Ukraine, we had one on the storm on Wednesday or Thursday, and sort of all the other MPs know who I am, obviously, but I don't really know who they all are. So I need to work on that quite quickly, I think. But that is very odd, you know. And I'm naturally, I think people would be surprised to find out this about me, but I'm actually quite shy naturally. So it is quite a bit of a strange thing to get used to.
I can absolutely imagine, and I can imagine there's still an element of new kid in school kind of to this as well, where you're going in and there's all of these relationships and these networks and new things that you have to learn. And actually, okay, so again, slight slant and change in direction of questioning. So what has surprised you the most since you took office?
So the thing that really surprised me, and so I've watched quite a lot of parliamentary TV, and I'd never realised that they physically lock the doors to the lobbies, and when the speaker yells unlock, somebody actually physically goes and unlocks them. So it was just, I couldn't believe that on the first day, and I'm sure if I'd watched more attentively, I would have known that. So that's, you know, there's all that sort of arcane tradition really is mind-blowing and so unnecessary, and the fact that you have to physically be there to vote is just, I just think it's ridiculous, and it's very kind of it's like something out of a film, really, when the division bell rings. There are bells everywhere, so you can hear it from wherever you are, but they're really kind of old and tinny sounding, and then there's a sort of Pavlovian reaction, you know, every time the bell rings everyone kind of looks up, and you've got 7 minutes to get down there, and I just find that bizarre. I just think, you know, we should be able to do that electronically. It's very, very unnecessarily difficult. So if you've got COVID, for example, which a lot of people have had, then you can't be there for key votes, and there's no mechanism to get someone else to vote for you. So, you know, or if you had any illness or any good reason why you couldn't be there, that seems to me to be a real shame, and something that could be easily overcome. So that's surprising. The other thing that surprises me daily is that I think...
1 moment. There we go, Karen.
I think J.K. Rowling had been to the Palace of Westminster and based reports on it, because I'm sure the staircase is moved. So finding your way around is quite difficult, and you have to kind of stick to the route that you've learned. If you go somewhere with a different MP and they take you on a different route, it's really confusing and quite terrifying. You think, don't leave me because I don't know where I'm going. So that's the thing I found hardest, actually, is just not getting lost. I think I've nailed it now. But the first week it was really difficult.
Well, I have absolutely no doubt that you'll find your way, and I recognise that I've had the pleasure of kind of throwing a few questions at you. So I'm going to go to the audience and see what other questions have come up in the chat. The first one is from a person who's also going through their own parliamentary by-election at the moment. So Lee Darg, who's currently standing for the Lib Dems in Erdington, and I'm just going to read his comment verbatim. So he said, question for Helen. Obviously, this was a fantastic win, but thank you for standing as a candidate in the first place. Despite being the front and centre of a campaign, being a candidate can often feel quite lonely and take a toll on physical and mental health. What tips do you have for candidates on dealing with this? Great question, Lee. Thank you.
That is a really, really great question. The thing I found most, actually, was that because it was a sort of a head office by-election machine, I had to just do as I was told for quite big chunks of the by-election campaign. And so by the time I was elected as MP, I had quite low self-confidence, because it was just a question of, what do I have to do now? I'll just do as I'm told, you know, the press team tell you what to say, almost. And so you just don't necessarily feel like you've got the sort of the personal confidence to get up and running straight away, and it takes a few weeks to get that back. I think if you're in the eye of a media storm, you do just have to try and just ignore what they're saying about you. That's really hard to do. And, you know, switch off Twitter, give your password to someone else and let them deal with it. I think I would definitely recommend. I think the days I found hardest were when there was some difficult stuff on Twitter, bizarrely coming from the Labour Party. And you just need to switch it off. There's no other way of getting around it, and remind yourself that actually it feels personal, but it isn't personal. It's about winning an election campaign. And then the other thing I would say is, there are lines that you have to draw. So I can remember saying, well, we've put an interview with the Sun in for you on the last week of the election campaign, and I just said, I'm not doing it. They're only going to try and trip me up, and I'm not interested in that at this stage. So absolutely no way. And you do have to have lines that you're willing to say, that's too much for me. And also, you need to occasionally be able to say, I need to take an afternoon off, because 6 or 7 weeks of every single day, really intense focus is really exhausting. And you do need to kind of just occasionally say, I can't face wandering around in the rain this afternoon. I'm just going to go and, I don't know what I did. I think cleaned out my chickens and things like that, just to kind of do something completely normal and away from that intense pressure.
And the next question that we have is from Laura McCarthy, and actually a similar theme around candidates. So again, I'll read verbatim, but she says, many candidates are often put off standing as an MP due to the family pressures. How do you juggle being a mum and an MP?
Yes, that's really difficult, and that's one of the biggest challenges of first being elected. So I felt at the beginning of the by-election campaign, because we weren't necessarily expecting to win it, we thought we would do a really good job and get a really good second, but I don't think anybody was really expecting to win at the beginning. So it was easy to say, this is going to be 6 weeks of madness and then we'll go back to normal. And then when I got elected, clearly that isn't going to be the case. So you have to have, if you've got children, you have to have a partner who's going to absolutely support you, because it's not manageable otherwise. I'm in London from Monday morning until late Wednesday night. And if we vote late, I'm not home till Thursday, because, as I'm sure you're all aware, the trains to Worm aren't the most reliable or frequent. So you have to have somebody who's willing to, take your kids to school, go to Tesco, all that kind of stuff, really. So that's really, really important. And you also have to carve out time. So I carve out, time in the morning and time in the evening to do a FaceTime on the days that I'm away. And then on Fridays, when I'm definitely there, I say I'm stopping at 3:30 and I'm picking my son up from school today, because I don't want him to just think that I've abandoned him for this kind of exciting new career. So it is a challenge, there's no question about it. And I wouldn't have done it if he'd been a little bit younger, because he's 13 now. He kind of gets it, and he's on his computer a lot of the time and doesn't sort of want to be around his mum all the time anyway. But if he'd been younger, I think it would have been really difficult.
13 is actually quite an interesting age, because this is a question off the top of my head, but I imagine that for him, he's gone into kind of school and he's suddenly the MP's the MP's son to some extent. So has he spoken to you all about how he's found it, or kind of his experiences as he's gone on this journey as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been some of that. He's had, lots of people, lots of teachers saying congratulations and all that kind of thing. And he's very shy, so he doesn't really like any of that focus. I've been quite careful not to have him put on leaflets and all that kind of thing, because he just would hate it. And I think you've got to be respectful of your family's privacy as well. I think he's really proud and really pleased, but I also think sometimes he would like to go back to normal and not have that element of sort of spotlight that he's not very comfortable with. I mean, if we go for a walk now, people stop us and talk to us, and he doesn't like that at all. He kind of, skulks off into the distance. But his friends, to be honest with you, it was interesting for a week, but now they're just all back on FIFA or whatever it is they play online. So it's not too bad.
I can imagine. Yeah, I can imagine for a number of teenagers, it kind of be almost a bit of an element of, oh yeah, this is lovely, kind of shrug, and then carry on doing.
Yeah, what was that? Yeah. What's the next bit of tech on my list?
So I'll go back to some of the questions from the audience, and I've got one now from Jennifer Gray, and she says, it's fascinating to hear your comments about the Palace of Westminster. E-voting seems an obvious thing to update, better for the environment too, but what else would you change if you were able to?
I would change the electrics. So in my office, I have this, if you can imagine, I was at the bottom of the list for an office.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I don't have, so myself and my researchers share a tiny office with no window. It's got a skylight, but it's got no window. So and it's really quite old fashioned and not in a great state, but it's only got 3 plug sockets. And when you've got like the TV, so that you can see what's going on, that has Parliament TV on it all the time, so you can see what's going on in the chamber. Obviously 2 computers, 2 monitors, a fridge, a kettle, And anything else that you want to plug in, phone chargers, for example, 3 sockets isn't enough, and they're all in the same place. So we literally have extension cables daisy chained
Oh my
across
God.
across the office, which all the MPs on that corridor do. I'm up with the DUP and sort of those type of people, and other more important MP staff. And they've all got this situation going on with the electrics. I just think this whole place is going to go up in smoke. It's absolutely terrifying. So I would change the electrics. Other than that, you know, I'm a big believer that the heritage part of it is really important. You know, it's what makes people feel connected to the past and where we've come from as a democracy. So I quite like the old building and that kind of sense of history. But I think we need to be updating what we do within it. And for me, that's things, obviously electoral reform, but things on a practical day-to-day basis, like electronic voting, and you know, some of the ridiculous bits around where you can and can't go and all that kind of stuff. I think I would update some of that.
Okay, interesting. And I think it's a point around kind of how you marry the old and the new, and kind of modernity and history, and trying to take it on a journey. So all I'd be saying to everybody on the call is, let's do what we can to make sure that Helen continues to be a presence and a voice in Westminster for those kind of changes.
Yeah.
So going a little bit back in time, I've now got a question from Samuel Evans, who asks, in your speech at the election count, you thanked Labour voters for lending their vote to you. Despite our differences with Labour, what are your thoughts on cross-party cooperation, particularly in regards to a non-aggressive informal agreements between Lib Dems and Labour, as the Financial Times reported this week?
Well, I think there's a reality that we need Labour voters to lend us their votes in a lot of our target seats. And interestingly, the Labour Party in North Shropshire ran quite a negative and personal attack on me to sort of retain their second place, which was really odd, and on the doorstep went down really badly. I mean, a number of Labour voters said to me they didn't like that at all and they'd be voting for me instead. So, you know, we can attract Labour voters and they'll say, I normally vote Labour, but because you can win, I'm going to vote for you. And that's great. And we shouldn't attack Labour, in my view, too strongly if we want those kind of people to vote for us. So if we want, you know, Labour and Green Party voters to vote for us, we need to get the message out that, you know, we know that you disagree with us on certain areas, but please lend us your vote to achieve an objective. And they are willing to do that. And the more credible you are, the more willing they are to do it. So we feel as if, you know, Labour got 10% in the by-election. You know, we've got more Labour vote to squeeze out there. And now that we've won, we can squeeze it harder and more effectively next time. In terms of pacts, I think they're very damaging, because you can't win in seats like North Shropshire without Conservative switchers. They got 60% of the vote in 2019. And there's no way you can win without attracting people who are disaffected with the Conservative Party, or, you know, or who think we're maybe ready for a change. And they're very put off by the idea that we're just some sort of wing of the Labour Party enabling a Labour government. And it's really important, I think, that we don't put that message out. I think this FT story, they've been kind of trying to get everyone to say that for quite a long time. I think it suits their narrative. But the reality is, we did some polling before the North Shropshire by-election, and I would guess that Labour did some as well. And both parties identified that there was a ceiling on the Labour vote that was lower than the ceiling on the Lib Dem vote. And that's just kind of naturally how it transpired, that we allocated resources to where we could win. And there was Bexley and Sidcup going on at the same time. And I would imagine that Labour just thought, you know what, everyone knows Labour's broke. Let's focus our resources on Bexley and Sidcup. And the press are kind of presenting that as a stitch up, and I don't think it is. I genuinely don't think it is. So progressive alliance type arrangements are really attractive to people on the left, people who naturally vote Lib Dem, Labour or Green, but they're really off-putting to Conservatives, and we should avoid them, in my view.
Okay, thank you. So next question that I've got has come in from Richard Dixon, and the chair of the West Midlands region, and he's asked, what Lib Dem parliamentary activity would you like to see featured in our local activity /focus newsletters? For example, more investment in care services, education, wind energy, political reform. I think he's asking, where would you like to see that connection between parliamentary messaging and local messaging?
That's a really, really good question, because that's something that we're trying to work on in the parliamentary party, to try and use our time in Parliament to campaign effectively on things that will help people win seats wherever they are. So in some instances, that's going to be picking up an issue in a target seat and directly asking a question about it. So I don't know if you remember in the North Shropshire by-election, Daisy Cooper asked specific questions about ambulances in North Shropshire. Ed Davey asked some specific questions about railways. You know, it's a very useful tool, and we're definitely going to try and do that going forwards. So it's a question of, I think, if you have specific regional issues that you want somebody to ask a question about, then let us know and we'll try and get it in. So there's a range of instruments you can use to get time in Parliament. And obviously, you know, for me, my focus is North Shropshire, because it's going to be a lot of work to keep it. We think we can hold it next time, but there's, you know, not just kind of by sailing along and not trying hard. So I'm kind of focusing on issues that are relevant to the campaign that I fought, so that people can see that I've tried to deliver on my promises. So I'm focusing on ambulances, rural services and farming, essentially. But if you've got an issue that's relevant to the West Midlands, then by all means, you know, get in touch with somebody and we'll try and ask a relevant question. And then you've got the social media clip, you know, here's Lib Dem so-and-so asking this specific question about your area and your region. And you should try and do that, because it is really, really effective. You can also use the Lords. With a really big and effective team in the Lords, and they can ask questions, and that can be televised and used for campaigning as well. So definitely use representatives in both houses for that.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm going to pick another question from the audience, and so we have one from Richard Whelan, who asked, what needs to be done to encourage more disabled people to come forward as candidates, and what needs to be done to help them both with their campaign and if elected to Parliament? What are your thoughts on this?
I think that's a really, really good question. I think it can be quite off-putting, especially if you have mobility issues, because you have to go out and canvass and all those things, and obviously it's just much more difficult if you're less mobile. But I think we need to be supporting people with those issues, because there's no reason why you can't be an effective MP just because you're a bit less mobile. There are some MPs in the House with physical disabilities, and they seem to manage very well. The House Services, who are sort of the apolitical organisation that supports all the MPs, they're very happy to accommodate any kind of adjustments that need to be made for people who, you know, who have an issue with anything really. So disabled MPs and candidates, and it's just a question, I think, of, you know, finding a way to make it work. There's one of the young Liberal campaigners is in a wheelchair, and she's a really effective canvasser and campaigner, and we just need to maybe ask people who've done it, you know, what do we need to do? I don't have direct experience of it, but I think we should be asking those people who've managed to get out there and effectively campaign what we need to do to help them to go out and do it more, because, as I say, there's literally no reason why you couldn't do the job.
I completely agree with you, and I think it'd be remiss of me not to do a mini plug for Richard Whelan, who I know sits on both the LDDA, which is kind of focused on Lib Dems for Disability Association, and also on the West Midlands Diversity and Equality Committee, again with utilising his great depth of expertise in thinking about how we can create an environment within the party that is more diverse and is more representative. So I'll do a little mini plug for you there, Richard, as well.
Yeah, and then obviously Richard came along and helped in North Shropshire as well, and as I say, it's just a question of finding ways to make it slightly easier for people to get involved, you know, and it's not difficult to do that quite often. It's just that most people don't think about it because it's not in their sort of direct stream of experience. So but there's definitely no reason why you couldn't be an MP. There would be nothing to prevent that at all.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to the audience. I've had a further question from Laura. Thank you, by the way, Laura. You're doing a sterling job getting the questions over to me as well. So the next question I have is from David and Helen, and they say the BCE are planning to put Hodnet and Chesvidine, I apologise for pronunciation, into the Wrekin constituency. I am suggesting that Shawbury should join the Wrekin too, and Donington join Telford. Would this help you by reducing the size of your electorate from just 10 electors below the maximum? And that is a beautifully Lib Dem detailed question. Thank you, David and Helen. So back to you, Helen.
I don't want to lose Shawbury. I think it's our best box. There's no question that, oh my goodness, it's snowing outside and I'm meant to be going canvassing.
Oh, Jesus.
Blimey. There's no question that losing a bit of North Shropshire will help us in terms of the logistics of the campaign, because it is so rural and so spread out, and it is a huge constituency. We've got over 80,000 voters as things stand. So if you're going to do boundary reviews, I think, you know, we need to lose a little bit, and it makes sense that it's that bit geographically, because that's the bit that sort of sits neatly next to another constituency and doesn't sort of isolate any bits. So yeah, we did actually consistently quite well across the whole of North Shropshire. So from an electoral campaign sort of numbers perspective, it doesn't particularly make that much difference which ward we lose, but actually Shawbury was really good for us. Do I think we need to do Shawbury? I don't think so. I think it sort of sits nicely with the rest of the constituency. It gives us a better shape. We'd sort of have a really sort of long sort of bit pointing out at the top, which would be quite hard to get to, I think, otherwise, whereas Shawbury's kind of keeps it a bit more compact.
Okay. Thank you. I'm glad you knew the answer to that one. I'll be honest in saying that my North Shropshire geography is not great alongside the rest of my geography skills. So next question that I have is from Jed Marson, who asks, "Hi Helen, please would you talk about your national policy responsibilities in the party and your thoughts on what you personally would," kind of a similar question to earlier, anything that you would personally would like to change in your time in Westminster?
So I haven't got a portfolio yet, and neither has Sarah Green. I think there's a lot of acceptance in the party that because we're by-election winners and we have a bigger job to do to hold the seats going forward, that we focus very much on our own constituencies rather than taking on a national portfolio at this stage. Having said that, some people like Wendy Chamberlain have a number of portfolios and a huge amount of jobs to do, and are probably quite keen to get to offload some of their responsibility. So we'll see how that pans out. My preference at the moment is that there is so much to learn, and you have so much to take in and so much to focus on. And in my case, also reverse engineer a target seat in the background, a sort of party, the party mechanism to win a seat as if it had been a target. Actually, when you're an MP and before you get to be one, so I'm really, really busy. So I don't particularly want to take on a portfolio at the moment. And sorry, tell me the rest of that question again.
And then if there was, and maybe then to think about expanding on that and linking it to the second half of the question, is there a policy area that you might lean towards? And if so, what types of things would you change if you were responsible for that policy area?
Yeah, so the thing that I think is really critical for North Shropshire is the levelling up policy. Mm-hmm. So levelling up is very much, as far as I can see, focused on seats that the Conservatives have taken from Labour and want to keep. So you look at sort of northern, declining industrial towns that they want to kind of shore up their vote in, and where deprivation is often very obvious and very easy to see. But there's no real focus on the levelling up agenda on rural areas at all. And actually there is deprivation here as well. It's just that because it's very pretty, you can't really see that it's there. So if you look at things like health outcomes are much worse for people in rural areas, simply because you can't get the staff here, basically. And a lot of that's tied up with the lack of other services. So every time you lose a post office or a bank or a driving test centre or a shop or a bus route, you're kind of making it more and more difficult to attract good people into those areas and to retain the good people that you've already got. and that sort of is what is behind rural and market town decline. So for me, the levelling up agenda and making sure it looks at everywhere that's not in the wealthy southeast is really, really important.
Yeah, and you make a good point, because I think that there is the levelling up policy in itself. It seems to be targeted more around places as opposed to incomes and experiences. And so I think that what you said will resonate with, even to some extent, with some of the urban seats in the West Midlands, where if it's especially, so I'm Coventry, where there's certainly more of a tussle between Labour and the Conservative at the moment because of the results of the last general election, but it's historically always been a Labour seat. And yeah, there's these pockets of deprivation that might be overlooked in the levelling up policy because it's not as obvious, or it's not as clear to see.
And it's not necessarily always income related either. So as I say, it's more to do with sort of opportunity, really. You know, access to healthcare, opportunity for education, and the other thing that we're seeing, certainly in Shropshire, which we didn't see before, is post-pandemic house prices rocketing, but income staying the same. So we're starting to see, you know, to an even greater level now, a housing issue where young people who, you know, the people you want to retain in your community to make it thrive, are having to move away because there's nothing here for them and they can't afford to live here.
I think that ties quite nicely into a question that's been asked by Neil Sanderson, who says, kind of post-pandemic, are vulnerable people being overlooked as policies such as masks kind of coming off and not needing to self-isolate are being driven forward by this Conservative government? So what are your thoughts on those issues?
Yeah, so this is an issue quite close to my heart because my dad is in that category. So he's basically been at home since March 2020. Yeah, I mean, they totally ignore the clinically vulnerable, don't they? I speak from experience that he feels that he's just a bit of a prisoner in his own home because he's not able to assess his own risk, really. Once you stop free testing and things like that, you can't say, well, look, well, the case rate's really low, I've got a mask on, I'm probably going to be okay. If you don't know what the case rate is, you can't make those sensible judgments before you go out. So for me, the policy absolutely ignores the clinically vulnerable, and I don't really support it. What I would like to see is some science behind it, because I suspect that this unlocking that we're about to see is entirely aimed at saving Boris Johnson's skin and not really what would be recommended by the various scientific bodies that have done a reasonable job, I think, through the pandemic. And I think his decision making has been pretty poor throughout the whole pandemic, and I don't see a change to that right now.
I'm going to do my best on the fly to fuse together two questions, one from Sam Evans and another from Lee Darg. And what I'm kind of doing is hopefully giving you the option about what route you might want to take. So Sam has asked, if you could introduce a private member's bill, what topic or issue would you like to make law? And then Lee has followed that up by saying, if you were PM for a day and can pass a law on any issue, what would it be and why? So totally up to you what parliamentary mechanism you might use to get your personally favourite policy through.
Yeah, so I would bring in proportional representation. I think everyone on this call would like to hear. I think a lot of the issues that we face as a country, including disengagement from politics and sort of willingness to embrace more extreme ideas, have come about because people feel that their vote doesn't count. And I think engaging the electorate properly and making sure their vote counted is the most important way to reverse that or to counter that. And while it might not be the most kind of immediately impactful change, I think it would benefit society in the long run. So that would be my top thing. Interestingly, for International Women's Day, we are thinking about putting bills in with a focus, private members' bills with a focus on women's issues, which is something that's coming up. Haven't drafted mine finally yet, but that's the plan. But for me, if I was a benevolent dictator for a day, I'd bring in proportional representation.
And great. We're coming up to time, so I've only got a final couple of questions for you, Helen. But the first one actually links to the point that you've just made about International Women's Day, and it's because I have an element of a hypothesis that as a female MP, one would anticipate that you are under an increased level of scrutiny than might be the case for MPs. But do correct me if I'm wrong. the question is, has that been your experience, and do you have anything that you would share with others from underrepresented groups about building a political career?
Well, certainly since being elected as a Lib Dem MP, I don't really feel like that, because obviously we're 70% women in the parliamentary party now. You've always, I think if you look at it, it comes back to the point about being thick-skinned on social media. You know, the comments that get made under a woman's account are different to the comments that get made under men's accounts, basically, and they're very condescending and patronising. And when you're dealing, I think, maybe with some of the more traditional male MPs, that's the attitude as well. It's more kind of, you know, oh, bless her sort of attitude. I've always worked in a sort of pretty male environment. So when I trained to be an accountant, I think there were 5 women in my department of 30 something. And I just ignore it. I just tend to take the view, well, you know, it's your problem, not mine. And that's how I've always dealt with it. But I think it's also quite important not to look at everything through that lens as well. There are always going to be people who are sexist, or, you know, whatever your difference is, whether they're racist, or they have an issue with your sexuality, or you're disabled, or whatever the diversity issue is. There are always going to be people who have an issue with it. And for me, the best way to deal with it is to say, it's your issue, not mine. I'm pretty fine with who I am, and just try and ignore it that way, really. You know, if there are serious issues, then clearly you need to raise them with the relevant people and fight against them. But all that kind of petty day-to-day stuff, I just try and brush off. It's not my problem, it's theirs.
Okay. All right. So as a final question to you for this morning, and thank you so much for all of your answers. You know, sometimes you can be a little bit worried that a respondent might kind of go into a little cul-de-sac, but you're perfectly timed and kind of concise responses have been really appreciated, Helen, because we've gone through so many questions. My final one would be to you, kind of as you kind of look forward over the coming kind of years, what would you ask of your fellow Lib Dems that are on this phone call in terms of any support that they could do for North Shropshire, or anything politically that you'd like to ask of them while you have the floor?
Well, the thing I would say is, it can be, if you're in a seat where you've always been third, or, you know, you haven't done very well, it can be very easy to say, oh, what's the point, we'll never win. But actually, the more work you put in, the better you'll do, and you will get there. So I would say, if you've got local elections coming up, don't say, oh, well, you know, we'll never win here. You know, go out and put some leaflets through the door and put 20 quid behind a Facebook ad, because you will do better than you did last time. And it feels really good to win. And that's how you motivate people to come out and do it again. So when the North Shropshire by-election kicked off that first weekend, loads of people turned up just because we'd done quite well in the local elections, and they saw an opportunity to do well again. And so I would say, you know, never think it's not worthwhile, it's always worthwhile. And also, if you're out and about canvassing and somebody has a Ring doorbell, please don't go for a wee on the front drive. Which is something that happened to us on polling day. Yeah, just, you know, don't do anything silly like that. No. Well,
sorry, go on.
And I was just going to say, yeah, just get stuck in, and it's really enjoyable. But also, the final thing, don't go canvassing on your own, because it's no fun. Go with a big team of people and go to the pub afterwards, because it's really enjoyable then if you work as a team, and you'll get some good results out of it.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, bang on 11 o'clock. Thank you so much, Helen. I hope the weather clears up a little bit for your canvassing.
I'm not going to be able to get off the drive at this
afternoon. And without any further ado, happy to hand back to Richard.